So it's a great honor to be here today, and I would like to start by reviewing the history of this lecture. So in 2004, the European Economic Association signed an agreement with the BBVA Foundation, and it was agreed that there would be an annual lecture held in the name of the European Association and the BBVA Foundation by a world-class economist on a relevant topic. And the idea was to have an annual lecture at a high-visibility meeting, such as the ASA meetings or the meetings of the Econometric Society, and this lecture should be held in the name of the EEA and BBVA Foundation. The lecture is then repeated at the BBVA Foundation headquarters here in Madrid, which is today nice and very highly distinguished venue. This lecture is published as a lead article in a regular issue of the Journal of the European Economic Association, and this lecture has proved to be very successful and educative, and there has been a growing interest each year. This is the 9th lecture of this successful series that started with another famous and highly influential French economist, Professor Jean Tirole. We had a lecture by Professor Paul Seabright. The 3rd lecture was given by Alberto Alesina. The 4th by Professor Jordi Galli. Then we had a lecture by Richard Blandel, Daron Acemoglu, Ernst Fehr. The 8th lecture, which is last year's lecture, was given by Professor John Van Rienen, and today we have the honor of listening to Professor Jean-Charles Rochet giving the 9th GIA BBVA lectures. So in the name of the European Economic Association, I would like to publicly thank the Foundation for their continued support, without which this lecture would not be possible. The funding from the Foundation has also allowed the Association to expand its activity and also to develop GIA, the official journal of the Association. All these thanks to the Foundation. Thanks very much. As anticipated, today's lecture is by Professor Jean-Charles Rochet, and I cannot think of any more distinguished economist than him to give this lecture. Professor Rochet is currently Professor of Banking and Finance at the Swiss Finance Institute, which is a part of the University of Zurich. He is also Research Associate at the Institut d'Économie Industrielle, which is part of the Toulouse School of Economics. Professor Rochet holds a PhD in Mathematical Economics from the University of Paris. He has been visiting professor at the London School of Economics. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society since 1995. He was president of the Econometric Society. He has also been a council member of the European Economic Association. Professor Rochet has advised the IMF, the Federal Reserve, and the European Central Bank on issues related to financial crisis and banking. He has written more than 60 articles published in the best international scientific journal in the profession, such as Econometrica, Review of Economic Studies, Journal of Economic Theory, and alike. He has written 5 books, including Microeconomics of Banking, with Xavier Freixas, published by the MIT Press. This is a classic, well-known, and widely used textbook about the economics of banking. He has also recently published another book on a very important topic titled Why Are There So Many Banking Crises, which is obviously of interest to all of us, and we should probably invite him for another lecture about this topic as well. Professor Rochet is an internationally renowned academic on the question of global financial crisis and related regulatory and supervisory issues. But Rochet research interests go beyond financial crisis and banking, and they include platform competition, nonlinear pricing, and theory of contract. And in all these areas, Rochet research has been highly influential in the profession. A distinguished feature of Rochet's work is that he has been equally influential among academic economists and policymakers. Rochet's work is an example of how sound economic theory can have an impact on policy debate. So I'm very excited to leave the floor to Professor Rochet. The title of today's lecture is How Can Governments Borrow So Much? This is obviously an important question, because this debt will have to be repaid by someone at some times, or government will have to declare default. So it is really a great honor to leave the floor to Professor Rochet to learn more about this question. So Jean-Charles, the floor is yours.
Señoras y señores, muy buenas tardes. Es un grande honor para mí de presentar esta conferencia. Quisiera agradecer a la Fundación BBVA por organizarla y también a la revista de la Asociación Europea de Economistas y su editor, Claudio Michelacci, por su muy amable presentación. También es cada vez un placer, un gran placer, volver a Madrid y ver a muchos amigos en esta sala. Entonces, muchas gracias por la invitación. I would like now to switch to English because unfortunately my Spanish is not good enough for a technical presentation. And before I start, I would like to make it clear that although I will talk of very serious matters, I'm just an academic, and even worse than that, I'm a theorist. This doesn't seem to be working. Sorry. So, you know, don't expect from me any practical or immediately applicable recommendation about fiscal consolidation in Spain and more generally about economic policy in the Eurozone. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not an expert on Spain. I will just try to present you with what I think is an original approach to the sustainability of public debt, the reasons why governments have been able to borrow so much in the recent years, and what can be done about it. So the motivation is simple. In the last 20 years of the 20th century, sovereign debt crises were specific to developing countries. And this is a list, an impressive list of sovereign defaults in the last 20 years of the 20th century. So all is concern developing countries. And it's not a mystery that academic research has focused really on this question of why developing countries default so often. This represents the fraction of the time spent in default by Latin American countries, for example, between 1825 and 1940. And you can see a most exhaustive list of Latin American countries with an impressive proportion of the time they were spending in default. So there is really a specific debt intolerance problem. And this paradigm of debt intolerance was developed by Reinhardt, Rogoff, and Sevastano in a famous paper. They show that basically developing countries default at very low level of debt to GDP ratio. So this chart represents in red the density or the number of defaulters as a function of the external debt to GDP ratio, and you can see that some countries defaulted at a very, very low rate of debt to GDP ratio, okay? So there is a contrast with advanced economies. In fact, emerging countries, or at least most emerging countries, have recently striven to reduce their debt to GDP ratio, and they have to some extent succeeded in that. But by contrast, advanced economies have followed the opposite pattern. Not only the level of debt were higher initially, but they have increased this debt to GDP ratio. And if you take into account implicit public debt, what do I mean by implicit public debt? I mean that due to aging population in those advanced countries, it is very likely that the governments will have to sustain or participate in the financing of public pensions and also public health care. And so if you include this additional implicit debt, then you find very frightening projection. For example, this represents the projection of general government debt in the United States and in Japan, depending on different scenarios about the evolution of this implicit debt. But in all cases, you see that the level of debt to GDP become huge. So this is probably not sustainable in the long run. If we look at the European situation, as we know, the Greek default has been a trauma, and it has made investors pessimistic about other countries. Okay, so initially the spreads in Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Ireland were very low, but following the Greek default and the fact that the spreads, spiked, there has been some contagion to these other countries. So is it something that is perfectly rational, or is there some kind of irrational panic involved in that? Well, we'll see. If you look at Spanish debt, again in percentage of GDP, you see that it was very low initially compared to other countries, compared to the UK, to Europe, or United States or Germany. And it's true that it has increased recently. So unfortunately, the data stopped at 2010, so the debt has continued to increase. But still, it's lower than in many other countries. Moreover, Spain has accepted a huge effort for fiscal consolidation, especially given that it had, at the same time, to support its banking industry. So this picture represents the deficit of the Spanish public budget. But if you take into account, if you take out the support to the financial industry, you find that there is a remarkable effort to decrease. Even though there are still a deficit, this deficit has decreased dramatically in the recent years. So the starting point of this research is, in fact, a combination of two frustrations. The first frustration is that there is no rigorous benchmark for estimating the probabilities of default of countries, okay? So for corporates, we have well-established methods for estimating the probability of default of corporates. For countries, we don't have anything like that. So what level of public debt is sustainable? Why is it that some countries default only a 30% debt to GDP ratio, while other countries can afford ratios well above 100%? The second frustration is that there is no clear understanding of the reasons why governments of advanced countries have been able to borrow so much. So I will examine two research questions corresponding to two papers that I've written with my colleagues Fabrice Collard from Bern and Michel Habib also from Zurich. One is sovereign debt sustainability in advanced economy, and it tries to answer the question, can we find a very simple yet rigorous way to assess sustainability of public debt for advanced economy? And this is, I will spend most of my time on that, but I will also discuss the second topic, which is what are the causes of the tendency of governments to borrow so much and what can be done about it. And it corresponds to the second paper, a public choice theory of sovereign debt. So if you look at the academic literature on debt sustainability, you realize that it's very meager because academic literature on sovereign debt, which is huge, has focused on the notion of optimal debt level, supposed to be chosen by benevolent governments. So it's the idea that the government is going to choose the level of debt that is optimal for the country. And what we do instead is first look at maximal debt ratio instead of optimal debt ratio, and then we will assume that the governments are not benevolent but are self-interested, and this will change the picture. If you look at the IMF methods for assigning sustainability, they have a method called DSA. And if you look also at rating agencies, you realize that there are pragmatic methods for assessing the probability of default of the country, but they are very qualitative. And of course, the problem is very complex. But what is missing is a simple formula that, of course, has to be taken with a grain of salt and has to be, modified with certain parameters added, but there is no simple benchmark. For corporate bonds, we have simple benchmark, and the market use the simplest benchmark. We don't have anything like that for sovereign debt. So the plan of the presentation will be first to look at this question of sustainability. And for that, I will just present quickly a benchmark model that will go quickly to the data and the calibration of this formula. And then, in the second part of the talk, I will first try to explain why debt has been so much increased in the recent years and what can be done about it. So let me start. I don't want to bother you with the equations, but I need a minimum presentation in order to show you the current or the important parameters. So we assume that the growth process of the country is exogenous in real terms. And so YT is the GDP of the country, the output of the country at a certain date, and it grows at a rate GT. And GT is supposed in the benchmark model to be independently distributed and stationary, okay? So the stars each time indicate the assumptions that are relaxed. So I present you the simplest possible version, and then I will briefly discuss what happened when these assumptions are relaxed. So there is also a constant risk-free rate. It's also an assumption that needs to be relaxed. And then the crucial thing is that everything is measured in proportion to GDP. For example, the government borrowing at date T, and we assume for simplicity that debt is only short-term debt, one period only, is a fraction BT or a multiple BT of GDP. Okay, the government decides on what fraction of GDP to borrow. And as a result of that, it promises to repay a certain amount, DT plus 1, at the next date, and this is also proportional to GDP. But the important notion I want to introduce here is the notion of maximum primary surplus. That is, alpha, this parameter alpha, measures the capacity of the government of the country to impose sacrifices or budgetary discipline to the country in case of emergency. When you have to repay a large debt, when you are under the pressure of financial markets, how far can you go in terms of financial or budgetary discipline? And this parameter will turn out to be an important determinant of the capacity of a country to borrow. So we make several assumptions which simplify the analysis and which also clearly indicate, for example, that the model conclusion should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, we assume that the country cannot receive external support by other countries or multilaterals. So clearly, this excludes the case of European countries like Greece or Ireland or Spain. So it means that the model is only a benchmark. And if you want to go further, you need to introduce additional elements. But I want really to focus on the simplest possible logic of this debt sustainability. So the starting point is the relation between interest rates and default probability. So if you assume that in case of default there is no recovery, which is also an extreme assumption that can be relaxed, the value of the debt today, BT, the amount of borrowing, is basically related to the nominal repayment tomorrow, which is what is promised by the country, which is this number DTYT, but it's multiplied by the probability of repayment, or by 1 minus the probability of default. And it's divided by 1 plus the interest rate. So the probability of default, as perceived by investors, is a crucial determinant of the spreads of how much the country will pay in excess of the riskless rate. So in a first approximation, the spread is exactly the probability of default as anticipated by investors. But now the question is, what investors will anticipate about the future behavior of the government? And this is a crucial thing. If you assume that the government will not borrow again in the future in order to repay the current debt, then there is a maximum borrowing capacity which is obtained when investors anticipate that governments will do its best not to default. And this is a crucial difference with the literature on developing countries where strategic default is explicitly considered. Here, default is really when you cannot avoid it. And what is the most you can do? The most you can do is precisely related to this parameter alpha. You can impose fiscal discipline by essentially increasing taxes and reducing public expenditure so that your maximum primary surplus is this fraction alpha of your GDP. That's the most you can do. And therefore, the probability of default is just the probability that your future maximum primary surplus, L alpha times YT plus 1, will be less than your nominal debt. And this determines, there's a very simple formula, given that this is IID, this is the growth factor, it's just the probability that the growth is insufficient to allow you to repay your debt. That's the static borrowing capacity. And so you can compute the maximum that can be borrowed in this static framework, which is the maximum of the value of your debt given the nominal amount that you're ready to promise. And what you find is that there is a very simple formula. It's based on alpha, this capacity to impose a budgetary discipline, but it's based also on this parameter gamma, which I call the borrowing multiplier. So the borrowing multiplier measures the capacity of the country to repay as a multiple of its current income. But in fact, this analysis neglects the important fact that the government can borrow again in the future to repay the previous debt. It's the rollover. It's a kind of the spiral. You borrow essentially to repay previous debt. And so to capture that, we just modify the formula here by saying that on top of the maximum primary surplus, alpha YT plus 1, you can also borrow BT plus 1 YT. So you have, in other words, the capacity, the probability of default is related to how much markets anticipate that the country will be able to borrow again in the future. So there is a dynamic, what we call the borrowing operator, that tells you how much you can borrow today as a function of how much you will be able to borrow tomorrow. Okay, so it's really an anticipation by investors. And so there is a very simple definition of maximum sustainable borrowing, which is to say that the borrowing ratio, remember that borrowing ratio is the ratio of how much you borrow divided by GDP. See, this is sustainable if you can find a sequence of future borrowings that is bounded and that allows you to repay the previous debt. In other words, the spiral doesn't explode. The spiral remains controlled. Okay? And so there is a very simple result which gives you a maximum sustainable borrowing ratio, and this is this formula here. And I will not comment on the way to obtain it. I will just try to put it to the data. So we have now a very simple formula that tells you how much the country is able to borrow as a function of 4 parameters. Alpha, which is this fiscal discipline parameter, gamma, which itself depends on the expected growth and the volatility of growth, and the interest rate. And so let us look at the data. So since we focus on advanced countries, we have decided to limit our analysis to OECD countries, and we have a sample period that does not include the most recent years. And as I was saying, this is just an illustration of the methods. Of course, if you want to make the formulas more accurate, you have to extend the data to the more recent years. But just for the sake of the illustration of the method, we use OECD data for growth rates and primary surpluses, and we use the Reinhardt and Rogoff data for debt to GDP ratios. And due to missing data, we are left with 23 countries only. So this is a list of the first half of the 23 countries. And what you can see is that the four parameters, the three parameters here are this alpha, that is the maximum primary surplus as a function of GDP. And here it's taken on the past. That is, it's the historical maximum primary surplus. Later, we will use a different assessment of this parameter. But the important other parameters here are the expected growth, how much the country is expected to grow in the future, and the volatility of growth. And these are computed on the basis of the sample period, which was 1980-2010. So it's not necessarily accurate for the future. It's something objective only based on the past. So in other words, if the country continues as it was doing in the past, this will be the value of the growth rate and the volatility. And one thing that immediately strikes the attention is that the volatilities are very small. If you compare with the volatilities of financial assets, which are very often of the order of 20 or 30%, here the volatilities are of the order of 5, 6%. So it's very small, and this will have an importance in the future. The other thing that matters is that this fiscal discipline parameter, the capacity of the government to impose high repayment on the debt by, sacrifice, by imposing a sacrifice to the, depends a lot on the countries. Okay, it varies a lot from country to country. It's particularly clear in the case of Norway and Portugal, because in the case of Norway, which of course has a natural surplus related to its oil reserves, and Portugal, you see that there's really a huge difference. The other thing which strikes from this picture is that Spain is not in a very bad situation, even if you compare with countries like Sweden and Switzerland, which are supposed to be paragons of efficiency and fiscal discipline. Based on the 30 years of the period we are studying, the performance of Spain in terms of growth and in terms of volatility of growth was superior to the performance of Sweden and Switzerland. The growth was higher and the volatility was lower. Okay? So this will be important in the sequence. So we calibrate the model for different type of assumption, in particular for the duration of the period. We take 4 years, which corresponds to the average maturity of government debt for OECD countries. And also for the risk-free rate, we take the average US 4-year T-bond rate over the sample period. And what we do now is we will compare 3 benchmarks. You have what we call the maximum sustainable borrowing ratio, which is our formula, BM. And we compare with 2 simple benchmarks. The static benchmark, where you're not allowed to borrow again in the future. You just borrow once. How much can you borrow in this circumstance? And the other is what I call the equity benchmark, by analogy with corporate finance. And this is an indicator that is used in several empirical studies, which is basically the net present value of future maximum primary surplus. So if the country was able to pledge everything that it will collect in the future, so you have this kind of equity benchmark. And the reason why we call it equity, because in the corporate finance literature, it will correspond to the value of equity for a company. But of course, what we find is that those numbers are very different, not only across countries, but also according to the type of formula we have. And typically what we find is that the static borrowing capacity is very, very low. And the equity-like indicator, which is basically what you get if you assume that the country is able to pledge its entire future surplus to the creditors, you find numbers that are not reasonable. If you take our concept, which is in between the two, you find that well, there is a big variation. In particular, France is not doing very well in this, in this perspective here. But you find numbers that are more reasonable than the other benchmarks. In the case of Spain, what we find is something of the order of 100% debt to GDP ratio. But of course, alpha is computed on the basis of the historical data. So it corresponds to the maximum ratio primary surplus of the GDP over our sample period. Well, this introduces enormous cross-country variation. As I said, from 0.23% for Portugal to 20-25% for Norway. This is not reasonable. And also, it does not necessarily correspond to the country's capacity to exert budgetary discipline in the future. Okay? So we use 3 alternative calibration values for this parameter alpha, and which are in fact used by the IMF in its debt sustainability analysis. So it's a bit ad hoc, it's a bit exogenous, but we essentially assume that this parameter alpha, the maximum discipline that can be exerted by the government, is in between 4% and 5%. And if you do that, so I'm sorry for there are too many figures here, but let us concentrate on maybe the middle picture, where alpha is 4.5%. What you find is that the level of sustainable debt seem reasonable. They are in between 68% and 116%, something like that. And in the case of Spain, for example, you find a better performance than Sweden and Switzerland. And why is that? Because it's based on the performance of the Spanish economy over the period 1980-2010. So if there have not been financial crises and the big recession in Spain, if Spain had continued to grow at the same rate as during this period, then it could afford a debt to GDP ratio above 100%. Of course, I'm not saying that this is the right benchmark, and I'm saying probably you should try to incorporate growth expectations instead of just using the past as a predictor for the future. But still, you have to be careful about the assessment of maximum sustainable debt. So once you have a maximum sustainable debt, a maximum sustainable borrowing, which corresponds to the most favorable assumption for investors. That is, we assume that governments always do their best to avoid default. Okay, and this is very different from the classical literature. And since we maintain this assumption throughout, because we argue that it fits well the situation of advanced country, we obtain very different results from the assumption of strategic default, which dominates the literature on emerging countries. You realize that if markets anticipate that governments will do their best not to default, then they will lend a lot. And this is not necessarily good for the economy. I'll come back to this point later. So we have a formula for the probability of default, which basically uses this maximum sustainable borrowing parameter here. And this shows you time series of default probabilities. And again, they depend on the assumption we make on the fiscal discipline parameter alpha. So the black thick line here corresponds to the actual debt to GDP ratio. And the other, which are constant here, corresponds to the maximum sustainable debt ratio according to different assumptions on alpha. So here it corresponds to alpha 4%, 4.5, 5%, and here it's the historical maximum. So in the case of Belgium, for example, we find that there were episodes in the middle of the 90s where the probability of default of the Belgian government was quite high, essentially because the level of debt went above the maximum sustainable debt if you take the most conservative assumptions about alpha. The same is true for Greece, and what is more interesting is that the problems in Greece, if we believe in our formulas, started very early, started as early as 1990. Until 1990, there was no problem. Debt was well below what is sustainable. And here you can see that the different assumptions on alpha do not give very different level for what is sustainable. For Greece, our model predicts that sustainable debt to GDP ratio are in between 70 and 90%, but not more than that. And so in particular, since debt growth at a very high rate, as early as 1990, markets could have anticipated the problems. I believe that what is not incorporated here is the assumption that investors that the euro governments would come to the rescue of Greece. This is not captured here. But if you take that into account, then the probability of default was lower, but it turned out ultimately that default could not be avoided. If we look at Italy, also we have an episode, even though the situation now is better, we have an episode in the middle of the 90s where the probability of default was not negligible. Now Spain. If you do that for Spain, and again, you base your growth expectations on the past performance of the Spanish economy over the period 1980-2010, you find 0 probability of default. Why is that? Because, observe that, and again, the recent years are missing, so maybe the story would be different if we extended the data to 2014. But up to 2010, the debt level was quite reasonable as compared to our model predicts, okay? So why is it that our model is so optimistic about Spain? Well, as I said, these results use expected growth based on the performance of Spain over this period. And performance of Spain was good, okay? It's better than Sweden, better than Switzerland. Now, of course, if you revise this expectation, if you're pessimistic and you say, look, the last 2 or 3 years have been dramatic for the Spanish economy, but in particular in terms of unemployment. So if you take that into account, and if you anticipate that it will be like that in the future, then the probability of default becomes non-negligible. So again, I'm not a market analyst. Our contribution is methodological. We have a method, and we have parameters, and you can use this method, use your own growth expectations, and you can see what comes out of it. So I'm not ready to fight for which growth expectations are the best for Spain. I don't know. I have no idea. So, but maybe there is an element of irrationality. Maybe the markets have overestimated the probability of default of Spain after the trauma of Greek default. Maybe there was some element of an irrational panic. However, let me qualify this statement by saying that our formula also shows that the probability of default is highly unstable. It's almost 0 until you reach a certain threshold, and then it becomes quickly close to 1. And this has to do, this just a consequence of the low volatility of growth. Because of the low volatility of growth, so take Italy, for example. I believe the current debt to GDP ratio is about 120%. So it means that Italy is somewhere here. So depending on the assumptions you make on alpha, this parameter of fiscal discipline, you have different values for the probability of default, but it remains quite small. But suppose there is a catastrophe. Suppose there is another banking crisis or something that is really bad for the Italian economy. Then, even though the level of debt will stay the same, the growth will be lower, and therefore, debt to GDP ratio will increase. Not because debt has increased, but simply because growth has collapsed. And then you find yourself in this area. And in this area, it's very, very difficult to go back. So you jump very fast from almost 0 probability of default to almost 1. So there is a notion of fiscal space. A careful government would decide to stay in this region because there is some leeway. You can accommodate further shocks and remain in the safe region. If you are just at the limit or slightly above the limit, you're in danger. Now, let us come to the second topic. How am I doing with time? Okay. So now the second question is, how can governments borrow so much in advanced countries? And this is the second paper. So as I said, the classical literature on sovereign debt, which is basically focused on developing countries, assume that governments decide to borrow and default strategically so as to maximize the welfare of their citizens, taking into account the future generations. Well, I don't know of any politician like that. Politicians are typically myopic, they look at the near future, and unfortunately, very often self-interested. So we change this paradigm. We assume that politicians will essentially look at the short-term interest and basically will try to borrow a lot because they know that the burden of the debt will be borne by their successors. Okay, so it's always a good idea for governments to try and borrow a lot because they will not pay the cost of that. And in emerging countries, this does not lead very far because investors do not trust the countries. So investors won't lend more than 30 to 50% of GDP, and this is the debt intolerance problem. But ironically, the better quality of political institutions in advanced country is a kind of curse for the country, because investors know that the future governments will typically do their best not to default. And therefore, they allow the current governments to borrow a lot. And this is not good for the economy. There is a limit. So the high level of debt in advanced countries, in our opinion, results from the combination of two facts. First of all, the fact that politicians are often opportunistic and short-termist. They don't look at the future generations. They look at their own interests. And the other thing is, in contrast with developing countries, advanced countries never default voluntarily. They only default when they're obliged to default. And markets anticipate that, and they are ready to lend a lot, provided, of course, the spreads, the risk premia, cover the risk of involuntary default. So default can exist, but it's really involuntary, when basically the markets refuse to lend again in order to roll over the debt. It's the sudden stop phenomenon. There is a level at which markets stop lending, and then the country is in trouble. So we believe that reforms are needed to correct this government failure. So in a sense, the problem of debt is not an economic problem, it's a political problem. We need to reform political institutions in order to correct that. So several countries, including Spain, have recently adopted constitutional limit to public debt. And that's a good idea, because you say you don't put that in the normal law, it cannot be changed unless you have a qualified majority, and it prevents the future governments from borrowing too much. So in the case of Spain, if I'm not mistaken, the horizon is 2020, and there are several constraints: balanced budget both at the national and regional level, a level of public debt to GDP less than 60% unless exceptional circumstances, and structural deficit less than 3%. So Germany had adopted a very similar rule a bit earlier. And in fact, Switzerland, the country where I live, was very effective in doing that very early on. So they have a very clever rule in their constitution, which is based on output gap. And output gap is a complex economic notion based on the so-called HP filter. So it's the first time I see in the constitution of a country a technical formula with the HP filter. It's true that in Switzerland they have all kinds of stupid things in the constitution, because, you know, they have these referendums where they are allowed to vote on all kinds of things, on minarets, on these kind of things. And in the constitution of the Swiss Confederation, you have things that are a bit strange. But I don't know what to think. Is it a good thing that Swiss politicians are clever enough to use a complex econometric formula as a limitation to future debt? I have mixed feelings about that. Is it good or is it bad? I don't know. So I believe that there are ways to criticize those measures. First of all, they limit the possibilities for counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That is the possibility of governments to borrow more when the country is in trouble and to repay when the country does well. You can do that to some extent because of this structural deficit computation, but it's limited. You cannot do what you want. I mean, it's the general idea. Huh? You want to tie the hands of future governments, but is there a good way to tie those hands? It's not easy to think. Another thing is that since two different economists will have different opinions on the value of structural deficit and output gaps, you can easily manipulate. If the government wants to issue more debt, you just have to use an expert that finds the correct level, so manipulations are possible. And then, more importantly, the arbitrariness of the target. Why did Spain choose 60% as the long-term debt-to-GDP ratio? If we believe our formula, Spain could have gone much further, could have gone to 100%. So why 60%? Isn't that, constraining the future of the Spanish economy too much? I don't know. And also, it's very strange to put in the Constitution figures like that. I mean, it's something, Constitution should be something, I don't know, different. I don't know. Anyway. So what I favor more is what has been done in Sweden and in other governments, is the notion of independent fiscal policy institutions. Okay, so how does it work? So even if you have benevolent governments, so I've insisted a lot on self-interested governments, but if you have a perfectly benevolent government, you still have what economists call a time consistency problem. That is, once you are in trouble, it's always a good idea to use a deficit in order to compensate for, restart the economy. So since democratic governments cannot commit on what their successor will do, you have a problem. Okay, ex post, it's always better to allow fiscal deficit, even if ex ante one would like to avoid them. So it's exactly the same as the problem for monetary policy. And monetary policy has been now reformed, and independence has been granted to most central banks, and they have a certain objective, so the objective could be discussed, but the notion of independence of the central bank has now become a cornerstone of modern economies. So some people, like Charles Wyplosz, have started to say, why don't we do the same for fiscal policy? Why don't we have an independent treasury? The treasury decides on what is good for the economy, so it's not based on a rigid formula, it's based on the judgment of the experts, and the government has a constraint on maximum deficit as based on what the Treasury, the independent experts of the Treasury have decided. Well, many people think this is not feasible politically because, budget control is one prerogative of politicians. Even independence of the central bank has been heavily criticized. Some people say that it's anti-democratic to allow technocrats to control money creation. I don't believe that, and most economists don't believe that, because the true democracy is really to take into account future generation, not only the current generation. But I believe that the same idea for treasury would not be feasible politically. So the alternative is to have this independent fiscal policy institution, and they have, so basically you define some fiscal policy target, a bit like inflation targeting, so something that is relatively, that takes into account short-term fluctuation, but imposes a limit on fiscal deficit in the long run, not necessarily zero. Some deficit is feasible in the long run because of growth. When you grow, you can afford to have a deficit. There is nothing wrong about that. But also, you want to create fiscal councils, which are independent watchdogs that basically, publish opinions about the policy chosen by the governments and criticize the governments if it goes too far in some direction or another. So the effect of these fiscal councils is to increase the political cost of opportunism for politicians and to strengthen the accountability of governments. So this has been adopted in Sweden, in Canada, and the UK. I'm not saying that's the perfect solution. I'm just saying that Sweden in the early 1990s was in a very similar situation as Spain today. There was a high unemployment, there was a high deficit, there was a high debt, growth was really low, and they have decided to implement those independent fiscal policy institutions. And as a result of that, the spread on 10-year government bonds over Germany was huge in 1990, like 500 basis points, and is today almost zero.